Hello everyone, I want to share a little lecture on biodiversity and conservation. Let's see if I can get this going. I wanted to start with a concept called contemporary evolution. It's probably more important than we assumed. To date, it's likely to mediate the response of populations, species, communities, and ecosystems to gradual and sudden environmental change. So for a long time, biology thought that species really couldn't adapt that fast, evolve that fast, and there's been a lot of recent information showing us that there is a contemporary evolution, meaning species are evolving as things are happening in the moment. An example of that is anti-resistant bacteria. For example, this picture right here. And we know that bacteria are outsmarting us. Each strain we see can be more resistant than the next to our antibiotic drugs. You've probably heard from your doctor, please finish the whole prescription, and heard in the news many cases of antibiotic drugs not working. So this is one example of that. The other is, there are many, but these are three that I've chosen. A fish in New York, the Hudson River. There was a lot of dumping of PCBs, a heavy industrial toxin. Most of the wildlife, fish, birds, plants, all died. There was this one fish, a tomcod, that somehow resisted the poison. And when they studied it, it seemed like this fish had a special set of genes. And via natural selection, they had a poison shielding protein and could survive this toxic onslaught and did very well. Another example of this is this beetle that it grows and lives on corn. So because of the overuse of pesticides on corn, especially genetically modified corn, we saw the evolution of stronger pests. So this is the Western corn root worm, although it's a beetle, and it's developed resistance to a pesticide in Monsanto's GMO corn. And the gene was designed to destroy the worm's digestive tract, but it is not affected by it. So all of this is kind of a prelude to thinking about biodiversity. And what is biodiversity? I know you saw some videos and you did some readings, but it's such a fun topic. I just wanted to have a little video on it to share with you. So the term biodiversity comes from the words biological and diversity, smushed together. So this is the variety of all life, all living things, plants, animals, microorganisms, and their characteristics. So everything, even, bacteria, fungus, everything. So why is biodiversity so important? Well, ecosystems depend on the combined contributions of the individual organisms within them. So the loss of any species can prevent that ecosystem from operating the way it should. An ecosystem with a high level of biodiversity seems to be more resistant to environmental change. So there are lots of studies that have shown these two effects. So biodiversity is important because the loss of, as we just said, all species, including humans, they depend on each other to survive. So the plants are making oxygen, we are breathing that oxygen, putting out carbon dioxide, and that's just one little loop. There's so much going on in terms of pollinating flowers, creating our food, creating our life force, tilling the soil, organisms that we don't even really see all the time that are doing work in that community that helps that ecosystem thrive. So the loss of biodiversity leads to the loss of services that nature provides. So what do I mean by services? Well, that's like materials such as food, fuel, fiber. Biodiversity helps in regulating the climate, waste, and pollution, supporting processes such as water purification and nutrient cycling, and creates opportunities for enjoyment of the beautiful outdoors. How do we measure biodiversity? Well, we do have two different indices that we use to measure biodiversity. And no single one will always be appropriate. In fact, some conservation questions you'll see in a paper where they report on several different biodiversity indices. So what they are is it's a measure, it's an actual quantitative measure of the biodiversity. And one is called species richness. This is the total number of species in an area. So you look at a specific area and you add up all the species and you say, this is the species richness. Another one is called species evenness. And this is how evenly the species are represented in the area. So that's, do most of the individuals belong to one species, or how equal is the community numerically? So let's say you're on a grassland area and you have 5,000 squirrels and you have 2 coyotes. Well, the evenness is not good. You have a lot more of one species than the other. So it tends to be better in an environment if you have more equal numbers, or if you're looking at predator versus prey, you want more prey than predators, but 2 to 1,000 is quite a large ratio. So what tends to happen in a community like that is you can predict that maybe those coyotes won't be able to keep up with the ground squirrels or the prairie dogs who are reproducing so quickly. And over time, they will take over that area. And what happens then? Maybe you don't see grass growing. Maybe the whole landscape becomes dirt with big mounds. And so again, lots of different reasons why they take measurements and record these biodiversity indices. And it's very helpful when comparing ecosystems. So many indices have been developed that combine different measures of biodiversity. The one I use commonly is the Simpson's Index, and this includes both species richness and species evenness in a single number for comparison. And you can do this in a rainforest, you can do this in ocean habitat, anywhere. Now, the major values of biodiversity are vast. We have environment value is just for being that environment, a social value, what kind of services, the economic value, consumptive use, productive use, ethical and moral value, and aesthetic value. And why do values matter? This would be an interesting conversation for you to have while you're taking this class with people in your family or your colleagues or your coworkers or your kids. When we measure biodiversity or set conservation priorities, we decide which species, which populations or ecosystems to study, to monitor, to manage, or conserve. These choices depend upon what we currently value. So what role do ecological values have in conservation decisions in your community or globally? You know, where I live in California, wide open spaces are very important. But there is an area a few miles away from my house that's been threatened with development for years and years and years. It is not built on yet, but the community values that. And so there's a lot of people that donate money to a nonprofit that's helping to preserve and protect it. So it's interesting to think about these ecological values in your community and globally. You know, the Amazon, that's a rainforest that's thought to be, you know, the lungs of the earth. And are we as a global community invested in keeping the Amazon pristine and preserved? Ecological value. Another concept is, does diversity make communities more resilient? And the answer is yes, actually. Resilient ecosystems are characterized by their constancy, so the lack of big fluctuations, their inertia, which is a word for resistance to perturbation, so that's being bothered, renewal, their ability to repair damage, and not all species are critical to an ecosystem's function. Many fill redundant roles, but the basis for community resilience and integrity is all of the species that are there. So if too many species or keystone species are the species in an environment that really affects multiple different species. So in a grassland, again, you could have oak trees that would be keystone species. One in the ocean would be the sea otter is a keystone species. You know, it uses the kelp. It eats a lot of various creatures. It keeps the sea urchins at bay from eating all the kelp so that the kelp forest can thrive. But if you lose too many of those, it eventually leads to the failure of the ecosystem function. So functioning is what the ecosystem does for itself, does for the organisms, and does for humans. So the direct use value is goods from the environment, right? Food, building materials, fuel, paper products, fiber, industrial products like waxes, rubber, oils, and medicine. There's indirect use values, which we call services. So this is how environments and ecosystems regulate global processes such as atmosphere and climate, soil and water conservation, nutrient cycling, pollination and seed dispersal, control of agricultural pests, a genetic library, inspiration, information, scientific and educational information, tourism, recreation, cultural, spiritual, aesthetic, community resilience, and strategic. Food, of course, is key, right? Today, most people rely on about 20 types of plants, and only 3 to 4 are staple crops. So the diversity is critical for developing new strains and breeds. So that particular environment, if it's resistant to pests or disease, we need to really look at it as a source for new crops. Building materials, paper products, and fuel come from the environment. So there's several trees, several grasses, most notably bamboo and rattan. They're basic commodities used worldwide for building materials. Paper products, again, fuel. And this worldwide production of timber for homes or furniture or mulch, chipboard, paper, packaging, this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. 63% of all harvested wood is used as fuel, whether burned directly or after being converted to charcoal. And fuel wood, charcoal, and other fuels from wood are major sources of energy in numerous countries. Fiber, this is cotton plants. You know, we have made clothes and other blankets and household items from fiber. I'm not sure if you know, here's some more examples. So, cork and rubber and shellac and wax and jojoba oil, really anything you can think of. Even carmine dye, that red dye, is from the powdered scales of insect bodies. Here's a little conglomeration of them on a plant. And they're boiled in ammonia or sodium carbonate to make dye. Medicine, 80% of people in developing countries use plants as a primary source of medicine. They don't have access to, a pharmacy, a CVS. 57% of the 150 most prescribed drugs have their origins in biodiversity. So traditional medicine is a basis of so many drugs: antibacterial, relaxants, painkillers, anti-cancer agents, cardiac stimulants. The list goes on and on, all from plants, right? All of these from plants. So the value of biodiversity is all of those physical, tangible things, and there's also intrinsic, or what we call inherent value. It's more of a philosophical concept, the value of something independent of its value to anyone else or anything else. So, maybe beauty, maybe just pure love and passion. So what role does intrinsic value play in existing conservation policy and law? How do intrinsic values of biodiversity impact conservation decisions? There's a lot of World Wildlife Fund, for example, groups that use charismatic megafauna like the polar bear to get people to really feel a connection with nature. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you for your time. I hope you enjoy this week, and I will see you all next week.